So hello, everybody, and welcome to this Zoom event on Kantha Quilts from Bengal, Simple Stitches to Rich Tradition with Jeevak Parpia and Banoo Parpia. My name is Karthika Odine. I'm a textile designer. For those of you who don't know me, apart from my design activities, I have made it my mission to make textile design and knowledge accessible to as wide an audience as possible. I do this through the Designers and Artisans Textile Club. So that is what we are having tonight, the Designers and Artisans Textile Club. And I also conduct workshops and classes. My classes are taught in collaboration with the Textile Museum and the George Washington University at in Washington, D.C. You can see more about my activities on my website, www.designersandartisans.com. I'm going to keep my information brief. So let us go on to introducing tonight's speakers. It's with enormous pleasure that I would like to introduce Banoo and Jeevak Parpia. Banoo recently retired as Director of Alumni Affairs and Development for Asia at Cornell University, and Jeevak is Professor of Physics at Cornell. And what is incredible is that they have a very, very important collection of Indian textiles. What you will see tonight is just the tip of the iceberg. And we are really privileged to see, just this little tip. Their collection began collecting in the 1980s, and examples of several of their textiles have been shown at the Johnson Museum, at Cornell University, at Mount Holyoke College, and recently two of their pitchwise, which was a talk that we had recently. So their pitchwise were featured in an exhibition at the Art Institute of Chicago. They also have an excellent collection of trade textiles. So I'm really hoping that we can coax them to share their trade textiles with us at a later date. And so their trade textiles have been featured at the Royal Ontario Museum in a very important exhibition. And they have also been sharing these trade textiles for other shows. So over to you, Jeevak. I would like to give you as much time as possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karthika, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to you all for coming to this presentation. And so I'd like to present basically a few examples of Kantha from our collection. And please understand, this is not meant to be a technical presentation by any means, but really more based on the aesthetics of what drew us to these particular examples. So it's a bit of meandering, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. And let's start from there. So basically, let's start with a few definitions, just as an introduction. So Kantha is basically quilted cloth. It's cotton material, and the stitch is cotton also. And it's generally thought of as being repurposed or recycled cloth, which is quilted and then embroidered. And this tradition basically flourished in the 19th and 20th century, and perhaps was a continuation of the tradition of Indo-Portuguese embroideries. So that's where we're going to start the presentation of images. Today, the term Kantha, basically in the fashion industry, refers to a running stitch on a single layer, and can be, quite spectacular textiles. But it's a real change from the kinds of objects that we'll be looking at. The designs themselves that will be seen in these images, they have, I think, special meaning that comes from the local belief systems and rituals. And basically, they grew out, it's likely that they grew out from alpanas, which are rice-based designs that are made outside the home for a particular occasion or whatever. Often you'll see that there is a central mandala or multi-petal lotus flower. And another image that also will appear is in the four corners, since these are generally rectangular objects, there'll be kalkas, which are kind of fanciful florals, but you may be more familiar with them as botes, and often they're trees. And sometimes, and usually all of the space is filled, and we'll see how that is a continuation of this long thread, starting from, as far as we know, the 17th century. And basically, both Hindu and Muslim households made Kantha in undivided Bengal. So the uses of the Kanthas, it's essentially a furnishing fabric. It can be used as for warmth. It can be used as a covering. It can be used as a seating, something to sit on. And so the various terms are sujni, which is essentially larger spread for bed or floor coverings. You can also hear very similar term used in Central Asian textiles. Lepa, thicker wraps, which retain heat better, and so they're warm for warmth. Ashalita might be a smaller cover, which is used for covering some precious objects. Baitan is a square for sitting on, or is a pillow cover. And the most common stitch that is used is the running stitch. And then there are whole varieties. You'll see satin splits, you'll see darning, and herringbone also will show up. So basically, the textiles are from our collection, as Kantha mentioned. And if we turn to the map here, so this is both Bangladesh and what is today West Bengal's undivided Bengal. We'll see some textiles from Calcutta. There's a district close by, Jessore, Khulna, Faridpur, a little bit farther away, Rajshahi, and Mymensingh. And the attributions where I've done them are totally my responsibility. I can't guarantee them, so nobody should take notes or hold me to it. They're really drawing on the knowledge that is well expressed in Bangladesh Museum. So I've been looking. I looked at their books and studied that. Yeah. So now let's turn to the first example. This is not a Kantha. This is a culture. This is Indo-Portuguese embroidery. So it was embroidered in Satgaon, and it's early 17th century. It's embroidered fully in Muga silk, so not a material that is used in Kantha today, but it's on cotton. And it was distinctly for the European luxury textile market. And court embroiderers were brought in to work in a factory. And the stitch that is employed is the chain stitch, so it's not one that is commonly used in Kantha today. Okay, so why did we put this thing up? Well, it's got certain similarity. Of course, it's exceedingly hard to read these. Even if I blow it up here, you get some idea of what's going on. But you'll see that there's a multiplicity of borders. And then there's a central kind of element, central rectangular field. And essentially every single square centimeter, if you like, is embroidered. So it's much better to kind of look at a real blow up taken properly. So now you can see that there are these three figurative borders. There's a wild hunting scene down here. Then there are a series of weird images, and I say weird because if we look at them closely, you'll see that, this fanciful woman with rather claw crab-like arms, and all of this is kind of repeated. You'll see that there is a like a quarter moon, which has a biblical scene depicted within it. And all of this is very finely embroidered and is quite amazing to behold in reality. Now, the interesting thing is that there are all these Portuguese soldiers wandering around in this lower panel. And the image that is seen right here is of a terracotta tile, which was part of the decoration of the temple. Now it resides in the Guru Sadeh Museum south of Calcutta. And it depicts Portuguese soldiers in much the same way. So clearly the imagery that was incorporated in cultures and other kinds of activities escaped and went into the local parlance. So here's another image, and here you can just barely make out the central theme is the Judgment of Solomon. And so there are 3 pyramids in the background. Here's Solomon seated on his throne. And, there's two mothers, a baby and a soldier holding a sword in his hand. Every single centimeter square is populated with things. It's interesting that we'll see that there is essentially like a half moon here, which goes into the central field area. This is the central image. And you can barely discern the edge of this quarter moon on this side and the quarter moon on that side, and the other ones are down below. Okay, so let's move on from that. So now we turn to the material that Kantha was made from. And so these are 3 examples of late 19th century, early 20th century Dhaka Jamdani cotton saris. So they are made in long staple length cotton, which probably doesn't exist today. And the pattern that you see is essentially in the form of a supplemental weft that is woven in as the cloth is woven. And so that thread is basically intact. It floats across the backside of the sari. And so when these saris were used up, when they were torn, they're actually pretty strong, but washing things deteriorate. And eventually they might have been recycled. So the material itself, most of these have a really plain feel. The material itself may have been repurposed in the form of a kantha. And it's said that the threads were unraveled and used to embroider the kanthas that you'll be looking at. So I wanted to give you a flavor for the parent material, if you like. So here is a kantha. It's a sujni, and it's quite heavily quilted and padded. So there's additional kind of cotton batting incorporated into that surface. It retains its original border, this red border around. But
I'm sorry, everybody. Jeevak seems to have frozen. We are having a slight technical problem here. I'm going to just...
Are we connected?
Yeah. Sorry, Jeevak, it got frozen. Can you hear me now? Jeevak, I'm sorry, it got cut. I can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Muted, yeah.
And then can you just share screen again so we can get back? It froze for a minute.
Unfortunately, yeah. Okay, so we should be sharing again. Okay. Is that better?
I don't see you. I don't see the share yet. Let me just see. Did you rejoin? No.
Did rejoin and I did share screen.
We can make you host.
Okay. That's dangerous to make me host.
Yeah.
Can you now see this screen, or which screen are you looking at?
We can see it now.
It's good. We are good now. Yeah.
Good. Sorry about that. So up till this point, we're clear, right? So we're okay to start on this Kantha?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So this was So this is kind of a monochromatic Kantha. It's very different, very unusual. But there are certain elements that you can pick out. So one are these corner elements, which are filled with three botes, central lotus, which is quite elaborate. And if we focus in on this, you can actually pick out the ground, and you can see that there is additional quilting in the ground. And so you can see the ripples of the fabric underneath. And that gives this kind of heft and texture to the actual textile. And if we go to the next slide where I have actually put in the blow-ups, one can pick out these very fine stitches in the background. And at first, when we basically came upon this Kantha, we thought it was unfinished, but it's clear that really you couldn't go in and refin and add color to this Kantha. I think that what the person had in mind when it was made was purely a black and white. There is a little bit of blue and gray somewhere in the corner, but it's quite different. And I liked it. I think both of us liked it. Both Banoo and I liked it because of its obvious relation to the cultures. So here's yet another monochromatic Kantha, and this one is from the Rajshahi region. It's a sujni. It's modest and it's moderate in size. It's not tiny. It's not huge. And here you can see the four moons in the corners. You can see this complex structure. Essentially, it's like a half moon that's protruding, and then the central theme. The quilting is absolutely fantastic. It's essentially a fish scale pattern, which is extremely unusual, and the border is extremely simple. It's got a few animals, in it, but the execution is in Rajshahi. Apparently, they use brand new red cloth, and then there was only the pattern served to quilt the content. So the amazing thing was that the original fringe is retained, and so if we go in to look a little bit closer at this, you'll see that central pattern, which is well defined, and surrounding it, you'll see the fish scales, and you can see that there's no further kind of quilting in there. So this is really an original condition Kantha. If we go to the next slide, which kind of focuses in on the half moon in the middle, you can pick out the features and the border and the two lions or tigers confronting each other. And off in the corner, this quarter moon houses a tree with some birds featured on either side. So really a very charming, again, quite unusual example. So these Rajshahis are things which I think are extremely uncommon to come across. Right? So here's a small button. This is a square format. This is kind of a seat. And this is more of a classic Kantha, if you like, than the other two that we looked at. So let's kind of approach this by looking at it, element by element. First of all, you see the border, which is very, very finely patterned. It's a series of tiny borders, beautifully arranged and embroidered, with a range of stitches used to execute the pattern. Very, very well-controlled embroidery all the way around. This field, which is quite large in proportion to the border, is divided into 9 squares, approximately equal. The center, as is classic, is a rose or a lotus flower, and you can see the satin stitch is employed, in this kind of rose color to define essentially the petals of the lotus. Surrounding it in the 4 corners are butterflies or dragonflies, who knows, but really wonderfully rendered. And then these 4 kalkas are remarkable. I mean, they retain this kind of botte form, but they've grown additional like supporting elements. And this herringbone stitch is quite dominant and beautifully executed. So they've interchanged, the embroiderer has interchanged the red, black, and then the white unquilted ground to make a very detailed pattern in these whorls, and they're just amazingly rendered. The space around the kalkas is unquilted, and they see some open space and then they fill it up with something. So here there's some ornaments and a peacock, and here there's a peacock and fish and fish and fish and empty flower. It's quite amazing. So really charming and amazingly detailed executed Kantha. We can, of course, go and look at this in some more detail. And you can see the amount of time that it must have taken to generate this object, to actually sit down and concentrate and execute the quilting here. So this is the only image that I have the backside of, it's you can see that in particular how they've dealt with the elephant. So it's quite nice. The quilting follows the contours of the animal, and the ground is in straight stitches in some directional pattern. And a lot of this is accomplished in such a way that the object will lie flat. And I'm not sure, it's not known whether they had use of embroidery hoops or other kind of tensioning devices. But certainly the technique that they use was such that it relieved the stress induced. So I'm not sure where I dropped out, but you can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and maybe we can go on to the next one.
Okay, so the next one is interesting in its own light. So first of all, you can see that the top and the bottom of this button, basically they retain the woven sari borders. So you can imagine the person thinking, why not just keep this? It's perfectly good. And what again, moving from the outside in, you'll see the very restrained, more colorful border than we had in the previous example. And the amazing thing is that you have a variation in color and a variation in pattern, which goes all the way around. And then as you work your way kind of clockwise from the right-hand top corner, you'll see that everything is under really good control until you almost come back to where you started from. And then essentially it's almost as if the person had a fit and said, let's do something different. I'm done with this restrained business. And so they they put in a whole series of animals and polkas and whatnot going off into the distance. The field is also quite remarkable. So if we start from that kind of crazy corner, you'll see a bouquet or a tree with nice floral images. And then there's a running horse. And then there's a rider on an elephant and a peacock, a magnificent peacock with a tail. Then this very classic image from basically calligraph painting, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, which is a pretty scantily clad lady sitting on a chair underneath a shade umbrella and smoking a hookah. So quite interesting. And then to one side is the leopard, and then there is a temple cart or rath, which you can see now horizontally. And then I think there's another bird that's going off before you complete the entire circle. So the central lotus mandala is essentially composed of whorls. There's a little bit of a flower. And there are these amazing swags that go around the whole central kind of theme. And these very well controlled, again, this kind of rose colored floral border, main border that separates this outside border from the inside field. So very colorful and wonderfully done, very freehand. And so you really get the impression that this is this activity is also a creative outlet for someone to express themselves and demonstrate their skills, as well as incorporate, because these are all folk products, so incorporate images that they might have had access to, such as the woman in the chair. So now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, so the next slide is another Baitan, and this one is quite different. So this one has got almost no border. It's what we think of as a lotus pond. So you have a series of lotuses on the outside. And then what you see is waves. So the waves are defined in successive red, black, and sometimes yellow embroidery. And if we could zoom in, you would see, I'm not sure if I can do that, but maybe it's, if you were to zoom in to this particular textile, what you would see is that there are additional lines in between. So there's quilting in white, which is invisible when you look at it at the scale, which actually defines which holds the cloth together and makes it a very heavily quilted tactile object. But the overall impression is like a dazzling pattern, right? And these waves are quite beautifully rendered around. It's almost like there's a lotus pond with breeze blowing over it. Yeah. And they're beautifully resolved where essentially these different lotuses, patterns interfere with each other. It's quite remarkable. And there's a bird sitting somewhere or perched in the water, or it's a lone figure, if you like, in there. There is a central lotus, but it's like one of the others. Right? So this one could possibly be a jasor. As we'll see, there's this kind of stripy embroidery is somewhat characteristic of jasor, but it's not certain, right? So let's move on to the next one. So next one is yet another pond, if I remember correctly. Yeah. So this one is a very different pond, very restrained, very abstract, and if we were to look in closely at this, not easy to do, but what you'd see is that each of these little lines is an asymmetric object, and it's, I think, what we think of as fish. So these are alternate lines, diagonal lines of red and black. There are a few yellow and a few gray. So the gray is probably in the bottom sort of left. Oops.
Sorry.
Yeah, right there. Yeah. So it's somewhere in the bottom quarter on the right-hand side. There's a little line of gray. Anyway, but the important thing is to see the symmetry of this piece, and then how it's resolved as this line of fish basically encounter the kalkas in the corner. Each kalka in the corner is different. So there's, they have red centers, they have blue centers or black centers, and it's quite a beautiful object and very abstract, no borders, very clean. So central little whirl in the middle, just to kind of set as a nod to convention, if you like. So it really had a lot of appeal to us. Unfortunately, we can't communicate, the tactile element. You can't set your hands on this piece, and this really needs to be handled to appreciate. Okay, so let's go on to the next one, and the next one is another small Titan, and this one again has this kind of central theme where kind of circulating animals around, but the beautiful characteristic is that again, the quilting is done within the confines of each animal. So there's a set of contours that conform to the body of the animal. Of course, the leopard has spots as well as fine quilting that is directional around each of the elements, like the legs and the head and so on. And the teeth are well defined, the eyes are beautifully done, all of that. You'll see the ground, by contrast, is aligned. It's kind of grounding the animal that's in that particular quadrant. So the ground for the peacock in the right-hand top, that runs vertically, so that would be horizontal for that peacock. The same for the horse. There are the lines which are running along like that. And of course, things get a bit confused around the leopard. But then there is this very strange lone figure kind of sitting off in the bottom, which we don't quite know, is it a human being? Probably is. But it's kind of watching the surface of animals circulating around. Again, quite an amazing and different Kantha from things that we've seen. Yeah, so let's move on to the next. Yeah, that's the figure. And the next one is, yes, so this one is a multicolor, possibly later Kantha. It's likely that it's meant to represent the courtyard of some house. And maybe this is a lotus pond, though it's really not clear what these elements that form the borders are supposed to represent. In particular, the border that's the second from the bottom. That one has these kind of almost squid-like, or they actually look like seed pods of some tree. But so they are everywhere. There's only a couple of, and they're very uniformly quilted. The quilting is, if you would look at these objects, what you'd find is that the quilting actually runs perpendicular to the long direction. So the texturing is very carefully arranged so that it's always perpendicular to the long direction. And it fills the space very effectively and kind of gives you a very nice feel. It reflects the light, or in a very different way than if the quilting were all in one direction. Again, the piece is quite heavily quilted, and there's essentially like a toran, which is a hanging decoration of usually flowers and leaves, so that you can see that in the top corner. And there are a few vestigial kind of whorls in each of the corners that appear in this particular Kantha. And so if you take a moment, you might be able to spot a single human figure. So if we advance the slide, that will become apparent. it's right there. Yeah. So if you click the next forward direction, there should be an oval that appears. Yep. There we go. So that's this lone figure, and how it's squashed in. Yeah, is quite amazing. So let's move on. And so now we come to a very different kind of content. So this one is almost certainly a city product. It's, again, extremely well controlled. The borders are just the many borders, but cast reflection back towards what we'd seen in the culture. And you'll see that there is a story border that circulates just inside near the central rectangle. And that story border we'll look at in a little bit of detail later on. But you'll notice that each border is amazingly embroidered. The botes that circulate around, they're quite different from one another. It's not a repetition. And the person who executed this really took the time to figure out ahead of time the effect that they wanted to achieve. It's clear. So there was a lot of planning involved in this kantha. There's no outlining that is kind of hidden behind the stitches. And so it's an amazing textile. You know, the complexity of the pattern and the execution is quite remarkable. So you'll see this reciprocal border, that's the second border around, and then beyond that, there's this multicolored kind of chevron pattern which pops up. And each of the borders that separate these guard borders, they are done in alternating colors. So there's red, blue, etc. And that's important from the point of view of the aesthetics of framing the central theme. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And the next slide illustrates as part of it's focusing more on the story border, but now you can look in and see the detail. You can't as yet see the quilting that's there in the white ground, so it's very fine work. But these are two images, basically, meant to represent circus coming to town. So there's a strong man who is shown on the left, and he has uprooted a couple of trees. And on the right-hand side, there is the lion tamer, who is basically placing his head into the lion's mouth while he's grabbed by the neck or something. And over on the towards the top, you'll see two dancing women. And notice that essentially all of the space is filled. So let's go to the next slide. This is kind of going in even closer. So now you can begin to see a little bit of texture in the white ground, and that is the quilting that's done. You can certainly see the diversity of patterns in that outer border, and you'll also see the additional kind of trees that are inserted in between each of these kalpas. So quite a remarkable textile. Okay, so let's move on. And so here, what we've done is we've identified the three of the images in the story border which relate to Kaligat painting. And Kaligat painting was essentially a takeaway. So we had people who came on pilgrimage to visit the Kali temple, very famous temple in Calcutta. And as a souvenir, when they left, they would buy these images which were made by artists. And the images displayed all kinds of current events, one of which was a scandal that broke in the last quarter of the 19th century, in which a young woman was sent to the mahant of the temple, Tarkeshwar temple, and to basically so that she could bear a child. And the Mahant seduces her and feeds her alcohol, which is shown in the Kalighat image down below. And you can see the rendition of that in the story border. Her husband finds out about this affair in the next year or so, and basically takes an axe to the location. And that's depicted in the second series of images. And the third image is actually of a different scene, and that is of a wife beating her husband. So the Bengalis were trying to emulate the British colonial, and they would spend all their money on pursuing women and drinking and so on. And so she is taking him to task, right? So essentially these images were incorporated into this textile. And Pika Ghosh, who may or may not be here, has written an excellent book describing two wonderful kantha, one in the Style of Tramrish collection in Philadelphia, the other one in Gurusthi Museum. And so I really, I really defer to her. And she's really done an outstanding work, and you should read the book. Yeah, so let's move on. So the next kantha is something that's quite different. When you look at it, you say, well, this is just, essentially a plain piece of cloth. It's nothing much in there, but you can see a few images, but that's about it. And it turns out it's a really fine, thin kantha, which is closely embroidered. So when it's backlit, so the next slide, the next slide, which shows the central portion, and that is made up of women. Around the central lotus, there are women who are dancing, and you can see that the hair is the first thing that is apparent. If you would look really closely at this image, what you would see is that they're articulated, they have their arms up, and in the outermost ring, you can actually see the defined odni, or the end of the sari, as a series of blue, red, or yellow dots that are circulating. Right? And then the four corners are formed of four women who have, elaborate jewelry in the neck, and the hair is beautifully rendered in these four corners. And surrounding the central image are a series of vignettes, each with a different image. And so it's totally remarkable. Let's go on to the next slide. So here you can see the similar image to the previous kantha, where the woman is beating the babu. You can see a small rolling pin in her hand. And let's go on to the next one. And yeah, so here's an Indian woman. You can tell by the bindi on her forehead that's an Indian woman clad in Western clothes, sitting on a chair and sitting next to a window. So again, it's very much a city scene. And so let's move on to the next one. So two women dancing, and you can see that they're wearing Western shoes, quite different. And you can also see on top, there's a very closely quilted, embroidered portion, which is part of the separation between the different vignettes, right? So let's move on. There should be a series of animals, right? So here you see soldiers in striped pants, an elephant and a lion. So let's go to the next one, which is basically looking at the elephant. And that elephant has remember, now we're looking at a tiny portion of a relatively large kantha. And what you can see is the quality, you can essentially pick out the stitches of the elephant. And the beautiful thing is that when this thing is backlit, the portion of the thread that goes behind the elephant, the light actually shines through and gives the whole body this kind of gray-blue color. And it's quite exciting to see that. And you can also see the very fine stitching that defines the ground around the elephant, now running essentially vertically. And you can see the quality of the stitching that, that defines that particular vignette. So we'll move on to look at the lion next. And that lion is similarly rendered. Terrific mane, though, like some reason it's white. But very charmingly rendered with enormous, basically forearms, right? So again, the degree of planning that goes into making these is amazing. And to pick out what you're going to embroider in each of these images and never to be done again. The confounding question for this particular contest, why was it made, and to what purpose? It's really very thin, so it's definitely the work of an extremely skilled embroiderer, as well as someone who was both patient and had tremendous imagination and access to kind of cultural themes and this quasi-Western and European background. Okay, so let's move on. Another Kantha. So this one is definitely Faridpur, and that can be defined, can be seen from the multiplicity of really complex borders. So you look at this and you say, well, somebody's taken a vacation and not decided to, to embroider the whole piece. We look at it closely, and each of those borders is amazingly rendered. They are quite different, distinct, have different patterns, different colors, and are, totally well controlled. And the next image is essentially at the center of this Kantha. And so if we go to the next Kantha, right, there we go. So now what you'll see is that the central portion of this Kantha has this beautiful mandala lotus in blue, red, and green. And this one really does stand out. It kind of pops out into free space. And the center on the right-hand side, you'll see a palanquin. So it's a wedding party, beautifully embroidered. And on the left-hand side is the dance that accompanies that. The four corners are occupied by these world supporting trees, and elephant and horse and peacocks and fish are all bound, in the field. So a really charming and amazingly detailed executed piece here. So the borders are, I can't emphasize how beautiful they are. And it's an amazing, it's something that really gives you joy when you view it and touch it, right? So let's go on to the next one. So this one is quite different. Here what we have is, around this Kantha, you'll see the original hem of sari border, and the very simple kind of leaf pattern that is circulating. And then, as we've seen in many of these Kanthas, you have this, confronting animals on one side, and a procession, in this case, on elephants and on horses, elephants at the bottom and horses on the right. Then comes the interesting imagery. And so the interesting imagery is that there's clearly this scantily clad woman who is on one side, and then there's a gent in his suit eyeing her, from some distance. So there's a little bit of social commentary even in this folk piece. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a parade of some soldiers, and they are above them or near them are two women also, dressed in some form of undress, and they're waving their their, um, their scarves at these. And once again, you see next to these two women, sort of an androgynous figure holding a hookah and sitting on a chair. So this is a much folkier version, but it still it incorporates some of these elements that we've seen, a little bit in the Kaligat theme kind of coming over. So clearly, I mean, maybe these people visited the Kali temple, picked up these things and incorporated them in. So there was clearly a fluidity and transfer of imagery that went on. If you were to look at this kantha closely, that is to say, if you were to look at the ground, you'll notice that the quilting is amazingly detailed, and there are many, many changes of direction of the quilting. This all makes this kantha like quite flat. To me, it's always amazing that when these objects which had utilitarian purpose were made, they were made, with some great sensibility, and it really shows. And 100+ years later, we can understand or begin to understand, the lives of the people who generated these objects. So let's go to the next one. So this is an arshalika. This is basically meant to cover a mirror. And again, it's Jessore, and so you have this strong striped kind of quilting element that shows up. And wonderful imagery of animals, a tree with birds perched in it, fish, and even an umbrella sitting upside down in the top right-hand corner. Very simple border going all the way around, and framing them, very tiny little borders show up. So the ground is very heavily quilted and has real integrity to this piece. This is a very classic kind of kantha. But you notice the restrained color scheme here. So let's go to the next one. Next one is, I think, completely, yeah. So this one is quite different because it has 6 different kind of images. It's almost 6 vignettes. You'd almost think of it like as a sampler that you see in some carpets, but there are others that look like this. So this is also probably from the Jessore district. Again, you can make that association by looking in that bottom right-hand corner, where you can now see that there are sort of 4 elements going off. One, opposite pairs in red and blue. And then in between these kind of elongated floral elements, there's a triangular piece, which is very specifically kind of embroidered. And that relieves the tension, makes the object actually lie flat. So again, this has, there are 6 different images, and the quilting is purely arranged, to follow the contours of the pattern that was generated by the embroidery. So let's move on to the next one. This is a very abstract piece, right? So it has, the series of circles arranged in rows, very kind of methodical, not so free composition. But if you look at it, it's beautifully kind of, they balanced everything. So they've alternated the red, blue. So if you look at the centers, there's red, blue, red, blue, red, blue. If you look at the circles that are defined by this grain of rice element, They're also alternating red-blue as you go outwards in radius. And if you go to the triangular corners, that again are there to relieve the tension and make the whole object lie flat. If you let your eye kind of follow that pattern, you'll see that there is a strong diagonal sense to the blue coloration, to the red coloration, and so on. And this kind of gives, without too much variation, it gives you kind of a sense of peace. Yeah. So this is quite a large kantha, and it's really quite an achievement to pull off. It's quite heavy. This is a heavy kantha, and to embroider, through all of this fabric must have taken some really strong set of fingers to pull off, right? And so let's move on. So this one is a classic Jessore kantha, and again, it's, look at the difference and reflect back towards the culture kind of pattern. So you'll see now the central theme is beautifully, the mandala is beautifully organized. It has this alternating series of birds and flowers going around it. And then floral elements off in the corners. And these big floral elements define the central portion of this kantha. And then you have the series of borders. And what's classic in these Jessore kantha is this peculiar stripe, right? So clearly the embroiderer had the choice of which color to select, and they could have gone without this connected theme. And my sense is that there were commercial coverlets, bed covers, which were being sold, which had exactly this kind of striped theme to them. And so in the late 19th century, when this was probably embroidered, they must have said, this is what's being sold in the marketplace, we can do that too. And so this particular kind of theme developed in some age of kanthas. This one has a script, so it's the only one I think that we have that has some text written in Bengali, and it's quite interesting, right? Yeah, in its own right. I have not deciphered it, but okay. So then we'll go on to the last one. And this one actually was our first kantha. It's probably 20th century. It's very nicely quilted, directional, quite different. And it's possibly an old or a Sujni. It's modestly sized, but quite beautiful. Still love it. And has all of the elements, these beautifully rendered elephants, kind of butting heads on the base of a tree. Very nice kind of floral theme going around. Right? So with that, we'll move on to the last slide, which is essentially I'm a professor, and it's nice to give a reading list. So basically, Tika Ghosh's book on making kantha, making home, that's the most recent one. The wonderful exhibition by Dale Mason from Philadelphia. She was the editor of that, maybe it's 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. Very exhaustive collection. And then the Bengay Museum has a wonderful exhibition as well. And then come the series of books from India. So there's Nir Saman's Art of Kantha Embroidery, the Guru Sadeh Museum, which is a wonderful place to get to. And the Bangladesh National Museum has a great catalog as well. And there was an exhibition in the Indira Gandhi Center in Delhi. And then another excellent book by Barbara Carl, which deals with Indo-Portuguese embroideries. That's really wonderful. Jyotinder Jain's book on calligraph painting is also excellent. And then there's a Japanese collection, Bengali Kantha from Fukuoka Museum. And last but not least, the wonderful series from the Calico Museum in Ahmedabad, which is titled Indian Embroideries. So with that, I think my time is up, and my apologies for the unstable internet. There's some things are out of control, right? I'm sure people have lots of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeevak. That was amazing. Such a delightful, diverse collection of kanthas that both of you have amassed. I'm not going to take up time. Everybody, please do feel free to, put your videos. I'm sure that this time we can have everybody with videos. I'm going to open up the Q&A, but before I open up Q&A, I'd like to ask Banoo if she has any comments about the this absolutely gorgeous collection that you both put together. Banoo, would you like to at least come join?
I've come to the screen. I hope you can see me. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's lovely to be here. And yeah, Jeevak has done a great job of describing things. So it's not much I can add, but we'll open up for questions and I can maybe dive in and answer some.
All right. Okay. So let's plunge in. Let's start with Dominique's question. She says, can you comment on the colors of the Baiton Kantha, in particular the yellow in the right-hand corner face? And I think she is referring to the second Baiton Kantha. I don't know if I should pull
that
it.
That is the multicolored one that we basically, that I think where the colors are running, where the pattern is running amok in the corner. Is that correct?
I could pull it up again and see if, let me just.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure it's this one. So, I mean, I think this, yes, so it's the one before that, yeah. It's got to be after, so I think, or maybe it's this one, is that right, Dominique?
Dominique, would you like to tell us if it's this one?
I think it's probably a later one, but.
Okay, it could either be this Baiton or this one.
I think it's this one, but
okay.
So that's my guess, because
there is
so the yellow is we find yellow in late 19th and Sari borders. So it must have been relatively rare. I mean, you don't see so much yellow, I agree. But I can't really comment on, what dye was used, because.
Uh-oh. I hope you're not freezing up again. Yeah, I'm going to stop share, and then hopefully Jeevak can come back on. But to answer Dominique's question, I think that she's also asking about cartoons used to plan the design, and that is always the question that we ask, right? Of all these embroideries or even other textiles. But I think that there were no real cartoons. Courtney, I'm sorry, what is happening today? All right, I think that maybe Courtney could answer that question. Courtney, would you like to help us and figure out what they did and how did they master the composition?
As far as I know, there were no cartoons per se for, they didn't, I mean, they basically
I'm sorry. I'm going to just put this off. Yeah, please go ahead.
There was an order in which the pieces were made. They were actually pinned to the ground, usually with thorns in the old days,
Yes.
and the multiple layers of cloth, and then stitched around the outside to basically hold the piece in place. And then they would start to work on the mandala in the middle. And I mean, I know from my collection that, I mean, the mandalas were not always centered perfectly, and that would throw off the, you know, everything else that came in afterwards around the mandala in the center. So as far as I know, there were no drawings or cartoons from which they worked in, and it was basically all done freehand.
Yeah,
So
agree. Yeah.
I'm just curious, are all of the pieces that you showed today from your own collection?
Yes.
Yeah, and you know, I am the Mingay
Yes. Yeah.
book was my show.
Yes.
Those
Thank
are
you.
all pieces that came from my own collection. So I can 100% relate to your love of these pieces. They're really wonderful.
And we also share Mr. Barani in common. You know, Mr. Barani was very instrumental in everything. So yeah, he's told us about you long time ago. I'm very pleased to see your show at Mingay.
Well,
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
I am very fond of Choji.
Yes.
Yeah, unfortunately he died.
He passed away from COVID. I'm not
Oh,
sure.
did he?
Yes.
I hadn't heard that.
Yeah,
When?
it's very sad. It was essentially a year ago.
Yeah.
Well,
March of last year.
that's very sad.
Very
It
sad.
is.
Yeah, I
Yes.
have in my presentation,
wonderful
I have a
life.
photograph of him.
He had a
So,
wonderful life, and it was just an honor to know a man like that.
He was amazing,
So many
amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And
incredible
very close to Stella. Stella, he influenced and she influenced him, and it was vice versa. So I think Stella was the grand old lady, but he was certainly the grand old man.
Yes, he was.
So maybe that would answer Kathy Stevilak's question. How did you source the kanthas in your collection? Maybe
It's all over. I mean, I think there were some that we got in India, and some we even got in
Canada.
Not in Canada, but in Minneapolis. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's all over the place. Yeah. But mainly in India.
Same for me. Same for me. I mean, I bought kanthas in India and in England and here in the United States as well.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I mean, they diffuse, throughout India. It's not just, I mean, it's a Bengali product, but people appreciate them all over the world. Right?
Well, they're beautiful.
They're fun. They're a lot of fun. Amazing. And I think the whole aspect, of why they were made, and utilitarian, but then also the aesthetic sense is fabulous. So.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I also love the fact that they come in sizes from little tiny purse sizes all the way up to huge bedspread sizes.
Yeah, that's
right.
And they're amazing.
They're amazing. Yeah.
And they were also made both by Hindu women as well as Muslim. And you can see, many of the abstract ones were done by Muslim women. And I find that fascinating.
That's a very good point. Yes, perhaps the abstract ones did not have any human figures. Is that what you're suggesting, Courtney? That's a very interesting point. I would like to add one more thing now that we're talking about the motifs. Zulfi, who will be speaking to us in just a month's time, is saying, do I dare suggest that the bottes, paisleys seem to be influenced by corner bottes of Kashmir shawls, particularly because they are not mango shaped, but have a distinct structure to them, which is distinct to corner bottes of Kashmir shawls. Any comments on that? So it would also be interesting, Jeevak, if you could, again, like you explained to me about the moons and the half moons and that kind of thing also.
I mean, I think it's quite possible that they originated in, because I mean, bottes were, the precursors of bottes were just floral elements, and you can see really naturalistic flowers with roots in early shawls, right? And so in early Kashmir woven shawls, and then the botte kind of was a 18th and 19th century kind of, it grew into favor and then was exported, wound up being paisley in France. So it's quite possible that they show up. Certainly, we have some embroidered saris which are basically embroidered in Gujarat for Parsi market. And they have really, strong connections to shawls. So it's entirely possible that, this form, which was clearly fashionable, transmitted into conscience, right? So certainly the Kashmiri bottes were there in early 18th century, if not, and earlier, 18th century. They could very well have, bled into the 19th century content. No question.
Yes, yes. I think so too, because I've been studying the descendants, if one can call it, of the Indo-Portuguese colchas. And there is a very small number. In fact, again, Jeevak and Banoo have a couple of examples. And if we look at those, these are also embroidered with chain stitch on very fine Dhaka muslin. And they have, you can make out that they have been influenced by Kashmiri arrangement of bottes. Sometimes, two bottes kind of coming together, or elongated bottes. So definitely some of the aesthetic elements, like you rightly pointed out, Jeevak, in the beginning, the worlds, those worlds that we see in the colchas, we see them in Kanthas as one of their favorite motifs. Bottes definitely must have influenced them. And it's quite interesting, again, like I was telling Jeevak, that the colchas were embroidered by men, and probably in what we call karkhanas, which are workshops. But the Kanthas were mostly done by women, right, Jeevak and Banoo? Would like
the assumption, yeah. And I think that's also what Pika says, yeah, for sure, right?
Yes. So so let me carry on with some of the other comments. Thanks for an extremely thoughtful and incredible talk with a wonderful variety of examples. The inclusion of Kali Ghat images on the quilts is amazing. That is Richard Isaacson telling us that. Thank you, Richard. Yeah. In case anybody has questions about the Kali Ghat, or would you like to explain a little bit more? What is Kali Ghat? What, for those who don't know.
So, I mean, there's the goddess Kali, and so she has, there's a wonderful temple. Well, I don't know how wonderful. It's an important temple, right? It's interesting because this temple, if you were to look very closely at it, there are there are images of Indo-Portuguese, some mermaids on the top of this temple. It's weird.
Architecture,
Yeah,
in the
architecture. There's built-in mermaids, you know, in bikinis and so on. Yeah, it's quite
From the
wonderful.
porches,
Anyway, that's an
it's from
aside.
the port. Mhm.
So the marketplace coming up to the Kali temple today is a, you know, it's a riot of color. But that same marketplace is where the pilgrims kind of must have thronged through, and that's where they were being sold. These paintings were just souvenirs, and they incorporated, you know, very standard images. So there's the standard images of a cat holding a shrimp, for example.
Yeah, and then also Krishna and the Shiva and Ganesh and all those traditional things that they take home to their shrines. Mhm.
So, and then on top of that, then there was this more contemporary parts of the Kaliga tradition, and so it's interesting that that bled over. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Thank you.
I
Thank you.
have a question for you. How do you feel about the fact that there is all of these things that are being sold now in shops and museums and all over the place, which is called Kantha, which has very little to do with the real thing, with the real historical Kantha. I mean, I find that I find it difficult. I don't like to see those things being. I don't mind the fact that they're being sold in the Minge shop, but they shouldn't be called Kantha. How do you feel about that?
Kantha has morphed into this new way of, this new running stitch on just flat cloth. And I guess it's a continuity of some of the old tradition. So in that respect, I guess we respect it. But you're right. I do not like the fact that it's called Kantha. It is not Kantha, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Banoo. Yeah, that is absolutely right.
Yeah.
Yes. But then just as you said, Banoo, we do need to encourage some continuity, right? So Courtney, I totally agree with you. And in fact, that is also why I'm so happy we had this talk, and so then happy that we are able to discuss these authentic pieces so that we know and people can become more discerning vis-a-vis what authentic Kantha is, because authentic Kantha is so much more than what I'm sacrilegiously wearing tonight. But there are two parts to it, and maybe the right way to go about it is to not call these modern embroideries Kantha, but to give them some other name, because you're right.
Well, yours at least looks a little more like Kantha as opposed to just running stitch on a piece of fabric, which is what most of what they're selling in the museum stores is.
Yes, absolutely. No, I think, no, even mine is not really, I don't think so. And in fact, this is actually a gift from a friend, and I nearly gave it away. And it just so happened that it was lying there and I wore it. But no, I think it's really important to know and to value the fact that authentic Kantha is done on layers of exquisitely woven, hand-woven, hand-spun cotton from the Bengal area. There is this whole idea of recycling those very precious saris and dhotis in layers, that whole idea of, using something precious and making something precious once again. I think all of that is really important, and I hope that everybody agrees with me, and that this lecture helps us to appreciate them much more. Okay, less of me talking. Let me answer some more. Let me go through some more of the comments. Manimala Das tells us, thank you for a glimpse of your Kantha collection, Professor Parpia. Thanks to the organizers. Amy Poster asks, can you please define the term Beitun? And is that a reference to a place or a pictorial type of Kantha? Actually, it's Baiton,
To sit, yeah. It's essentially baitna, to sit. Yeah, so it comes from, it's more related to the, yeah, it's a seat. Yeah, that's right.
Seat cover, yes.
Amy, I guess you may have missed Jeevak's first definition.
Maybe
of
it's
the
one of those
terms.
things that got cut.
Cut out. Who knows? It's essentially a small square that is, made for either a seat or sometimes also for Vaishnavite tradition of going from home to get alms or get food put in the thing. So these are precious little bits of cloth that are used for ritualistic purposes and imbued with a lot of meaning. And we saw some, we showed a few selection from our collection. They're very special little pieces, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Jolyn asks, what dyes were used?
Yeah. So it depends on the age of the sari that was unraveled or used. So the early ones were all just simple blue, indigo blue and red. Yeah. And those were the natural dyes. The later dyes, the pastel colors and so on, were made adamant dyes.
So you can date the ones which have the kaligat, of the images basically of this crime as being post, I think it's 1880 or so. Yeah. So that sets a firm line in the sand. Yeah, for those. And I don't know that, the Rajshahi one, the red one, might be 1850 kind of period. So I'm pretty sure that red is a natural dye red. And though remarkably you find there are early Dhaka Jamdani saris which are fully red. By the way, so there's one in the National Museum in Delhi, which is just remarkable. Never seen anything like that. Yeah, but it's quite, so those, they exist. Yeah. But as I said, it's written that these Rajshahis were made from bought cloth and not recycled. So I suppose that's right, because in fact, in this Bangladesh Museum collection, they have two large Rajshahi red Kantha, which have exactly the same characteristics. Beautiful.
Courtney, do you have any red ground Kantha?
Dhaka, sorry, we have no, and I was under the impression that most of the older kanthas were made of multiple layers of the very fine cotton saris that were worn in that particular area. And I found it interesting that you showed ones that had borders on them, because I was under the impression that the saris that they were made from did not have borders on them, or maybe they were just cut off.
They cut off. So they must have incorporated from,
But the cotton from that particular part of the world has been famous since the time of the Greeks, and was exported, to many places in the world because it was so finely constructed. And I think it's so interesting, the recycling aspect of the way these things were put together in many layers of these worn out saris.
Or dhotis, they were also men's garments.
Yes, dhotis too. Yeah. But I mean, that part of the world has always been known for producing the finest cotton in the world.
Yes. One more question. We are running out of time, but if Banoo and Jeevak, if you are willing to stay, I'm willing to stay. So those, I do respect those of you who have other things to do, but for those who would like to stay on, please do. I just want to finish up Lynn's question. Lynn has said you have shown a wide variety of designs. Is there any overall consistency that would suggest schooling, or are they all very individual designs?
I think they're very individual, right?
Yes, I think it's based on the embroiderer and the sensibility and skill of the particular
Again,
woman.
you can sort of identify the region by the region that they were embroidered in. So there must be some continuity of tradition in a local sense also. But I think it's kind of a family tradition skill that is learned across generations rather than being formally taught. So I think taught, maybe somebody watches action being done. It must have been.
Is Pika on the call? I don't know whether Pika is on the Zoom. Is she on the Zoom, Karthika? Pika, she really would love to have her comment.
Yeah.
She's there.
I do not.
No,
She's not. I don't think she's joined yet.
Yeah, no, unfortunately not. I would like to add that when I saw all the motifs that Jeevak pointed out, I saw that the minor motifs, which are used for the borders and the swirls and those kind of, seed pod-like motifs, those are all favorite motifs, right? Maybe culturally favored, right?
Maybe so. Yeah. I mean, I think Courtney's collection also has one of these multicolored numbers, and I think there's another one in that collection that also has the fish running diagonally in a small portion of it. Yeah. That's my recollection.
And some of the kanthas, maybe from because of heavy use, the edges would fray, as some of yours showed, and they would be replaced with a kind of tape that you could be bought in the marketplace as to just replace the edging all the way around the kantha so that it could continue to be used.
I see. And to reinforce it.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I don't think there are any other questions. Robin Mitchell, would you like to ask us a question? If you do, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Is this recording going to be available to see again?
Yes, I was going to address that question. Yes, I will.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will send all those of you who registered. And so, yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, there are lots and lots of comments.
Thank you.
The beauty of your collection, lots of very positive feedback. So I will definitely share the positive feedback with you in the, I'll get a
That's
list
very kind. Yeah. No,
absolutely.
so happy to share this and make it more publicized. Yes, exactly.
Yes, I do have to thank
it's a
all of
wonderful. Yeah.
I really would like to thank both of you, Banoo and Jeevak, and also Courtney for the insightful, feedback and comments that you gave us. It really helps to understand this art form and this type of textile. So I guess that is it. I'm going to maybe slowly close up. If there's any other question, Laura, if no, okay. Well, I guess that is it. very, very positive feedback, lots of good feedback. So I promise I will send them over. And I think we did great. And I do apologize also from my side for the tech errors, but I think we managed to pull it off fine.
Yeah.
And so hopefully the recording will also help everybody if they want to watch again. So I'll make it available. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so
And
much.
Thank you, Jeevak, and for telling me about Choti, because I did not.
It's
I
really
hadn't
sad,
known.
you know. I mean, I have a photograph. I can send it to Karthika, and she can forward it to you. And that's basically taken on our last trip, which was January of 2020. Yeah. So he was in fine fettle, you know. as usual. Amazing,
Yeah.
amazing mind. Yeah, wonderful person.
Yes, thank you for letting me know.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
Karthika, if you like, I can send you the latest version, which has this thing, you know, the last slides in there. And if you like, you can put that on your website.
Okay.
If people want to look at it, maybe that
Yeah,
that would be nice. Then they can look at the images and get more detail too. Yeah.
Oh, that's a very good idea. Yes, I can try to see how to upload the PowerPoint, either like that or yeah. Okay, let me.
I'll send you the latest version, which had the little bits added on, including some images of the outside of Kali Temple and so on.
Oh, that would be delightful.
Right.
That would be delightful. Okay, I will definitely put that up if you send it to me.
Yeah,
And
that works, right? So,
no,
Thank you so much.
all right.
And Amy, thanks. Great to see you there, Amy. Don't
care.
see your image, but great to see you.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Okay, okay. Bye-bye. And we will stay in touch. Yeah. Bye-bye. Thanks
Bye.
again. Have a great evening.